you make the accusation that the NRA is racist and that uses racial fear to sell firearms. Do you think the NRA is racist?
I think the NRA has a long history of racism that begins almost a century ago with participation in efforts to get laws passed in New England to prevent immigrants from having carry permits, and includes the 1968 Gun Control Act, which I believe the NRA president actually admitted was racist, but what he didn't admit is that the NRA had a hand in crafting it and took credit for it, and it was provoked in part by fear of groups like the Black Panthers, who were carrying weapons, open carrying weapons, to try to protect themselves from violent police forces in Oakland. So you go forward, and I think that history of racism becomes more coded as you go forward, but there was a spate of advertisements in the 80s about thugs and rapists that were very graphic. You move into the 90s, the NRA is advocating prison expansion and mass incarceration. And fast forward, and look who you keep close by now. People like Ted Nugent, people like Jeff Cooper. What do you say about events like Charlottesville? What do you say about events like Philando Castile? And moreover, if you're aggressively advocating for Americans to be afraid of the threats that are lurking all around, you're implying the threat. And the threat, I doubt, when you're appealing to people who live in almost entirely white suburbs and rural areas, which is where most of your membership is, I doubt that you're implying the threat is their suburban neighbors.
Well, and looking at some of this, because you mentioned, of course, you mentioned the Mulford Act, and you mentioned this was back when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, Black Panthers who were protesting. I don't know whether, I mean, I wasn't alive at the time. I didn't agree with that decision. I didn't agree with a lot of Reagan's decisions. I don't know why he's always the ultimate litmus test here. But you had also Democrat state legislature that was suggesting this. Whether it was a frighting or brandishing, I think is a discussion that we should absolutely have. But the bigger point is that somehow the organization is stoking racial fear. You mentioned this with some of the advertisements that you see at SHOT Show. You mentioned this with the VR, and you have it. I mean, I counted. I don't even know how many times in which you brought up race and you brought up racial animus, etc. But in this entire discussion, you haven't mentioned any minority, much less any woman that works with the NRA, any person of color that works with the NRA or has ever advocated for Second Amendment rights. You never mentioned Josephine Byrd's case. You haven't mentioned Colion Noir, who's also a commentator. And do you think that maybe, perhaps, Elliott, that one of the reasons that minority participation and advocacy for Second Amendment rights is because people like yourself, in writing these articles, purposefully omit them for the sake of a narrative?